Our guest, Darcus Howe. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest, Darcus Howe, broadcaster, columnist, Richard Seymour, blogs at Lenin's Tomb. They're both joining us from London. Darcus Howe, that song, the significance of it, and give us the history of your community of Brixton and how you feel this might fit into that history, what is taking place today. Now more than 1,000 people have been arrested across Britain.
It's very repetitive of what happened in Brixton in 1981. The exact same thing. They were beating up, stop and search. Operation Swamp it was. Actually swamped the entire community and searched anything that moved, that was male and that was black. It was a clear distinction. And that exploded, I think, about 40 yards from my house. I was editor of the journal. I led a demonstration of 20,000 people only weeks before. So I thought the best thing, I told Mrs. Howe, let's go to the office up the street and sit in there. And a serial of policemen lined up in front of my office. So when I was asked where you were when the riot was on, I said, you ask the police. They have my record of not only where I was, but everything I said on my phone. And there's a spontaneity. But the weakness is always the commentators, the press. It comes like a thief in the night to them, because they deal only with what has happened, not what is likely to happen, which is a kind of speculative truth. So they're always surprised, and whenever they're surprised, they look for people to blame, to cover up their own inadequacies. Whenever they're surprised, they create a plot and a plan of some people, I don't know if they were from Mars or what, as a result. And it is spontaneous. Now, after Brixton, the riot snaked, as it is doing now, exactly through Birmingham, Manchester, all over Leeds, Bradford. They even included a place in the south called Cirencester, of which I know nothing. I didn't know any black people lived there, in Gloucestershire. And so the snake is traveling along the same path that it did in 1981.
And what do these communities have in common, Darcus?
Difference. There is no difference in the minutest detail. The insurrection and the looting. I think there's much more looting now because they are on school holidays. And one of the things about young people, because I was young once, I like whatever in fashion, I must have it. Otherwise, I wouldn't get a girlfriend. This is the spirit of youth.
I wanted to get your comment, Darcus Howe, on I wanted to get your comment on the London Mayor Boris Johnson, who walked through the streets of Clapham, South London, with a broom on Tuesday as residents launched a cleanup operation in one of the worst-hit areas of the violence. He criticized those seeking to justify the unrest.
It's time we stop hearing all this, nonsense about how there are deep sociological justifications for wanton criminality and destruction of people's property. Whatever people's grievances may be, it does not justify smashing up someone's shop, wrecking their livelihood, kicking them out of a job. That is not the way to behave. That's not the way to have an economic recovery in this city.
That's the London Mayor Boris Johnson. Do you condemn the unrest, Darcus Howe? Do you, the riots that are destroying a lot of the communities and the business within the poorest communities of Britain right now?
Americans would remember the anger of black Americans at a certain point in history. Ralph Brown celebrated that explosion, several explosions in Chicago and every day. He says, "Burn, baby, burn." That was his slogan. And it was approved by radical whites and blacks. They have a reason for it. Secondly, they're very poor now. I have never known young people to be poor as they are now. In the midst of an avalanche of advertisements and celebrity with the latest sneakers and top and bouncing around with their little hats on their head, and they cannot get the money to buy it. So they rip off the front of the stores and steal it. I am not an Anglican Christian. My father was. He was a priest. And therefore I don't walk around with 10 commandments and use them at sharp historical, political moments in the history of a tribe, in the history of a country, in the history of the inner city. They stole it, and they stole it. I didn't make any fuss when they have a lot of MPs and members of the House of Lords in jail for stealing. I don't make a statement about democracy because a handful of them are thieves. So this denigration of Boris's people, because we all his citizens, and you look at one and speak about them in a certain way. But Boris is Boris.
The mayor of London.
He's an educated man. He loves Greek civilization and all of that. But Boris doesn't have and he's better be careful, because the Olympics are next year in the London inner city.
Let me ask Richard Seymour about one of the pieces in The Guardian written by Carolyn Davies, who says a total of 333 people have died in or following police custody over the past 11 years, but no officer has ever been successfully prosecuted. That's according to the government. It's according to a watchdog report. Prosecutions were recommended against 13 officers based on relatively strong evidence of misconduct or neglect, but none resulted in a guilty verdict. This is quite remarkable. 333 people have died in or following police custody over the last 11 years. This is more than 2 people a month over the last more than decade. Can you talk about the significance of this, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there has been, over the last generation or so, some efforts to overcome the antagonisms between the police and black communities in Britain. But that didn't obviously get rid of institutional racism. Institutional racism was acknowledged in the outcome of the Lawrence inquiry, but the steps undertaken to deal with it were obviously inadequate. And the result of that has been that there's been a disproportionate amount of stop and search of young black men, a disproportionate amount of harassment and violence, and of course, as you mentioned, deaths in police custody. But it's worth mentioning that it's not just deaths in police custody. There have been a number of recent notorious deaths outside of police custody, including that of Ian Tomlinson at a G20 protest, and including that of the artist Smiley Culture, who they said stabbed himself in the kitchen while police were visiting with him to discuss allegations of drugs. And I don't think anybody really believes that, but there were peaceful protests in response to that. Quite large protests by the local community, and to be honest, they were largely, in fact, completely ignored by the media. They were a very important democratic moment, but just completely ignored. And that puts these riots in an interesting light, because when one of the young people was asked by a reporter, do you really think that rioting is the right way to go about getting what you want? He said yes, because if we weren't rioting, you wouldn't be talking to us. A political establishment, a media, and a state system that gives people that impression, that gives people the impression that they won't be listened to unless they force themselves onto your attention, is going to lead to riots.
Darcus Howe, do you have a sense that the feeling of people's frustration, the poverty, the austerity that's being raised, goes across race, that you're talking about poor whites as well, but also that it's a class issue, but also that there are those that are taking advantage of a moment of frustration to riot, to steal?
Hello? Let me say this. I write a column, a fortnightly column, in the only black newspaper in the United Kingdom. And last week, before any Mark Duggan or anything, I write not from events only, from my historical sense, from my speculative truth. And I wrote, I hope Amy Winehouse is floating in the stars, speaking in the air of authority, saying, no, no, no. That was a warning. I am not anybody with special qualities that I could divine what is happening tomorrow. I am not some of those people who do it by magic and you pay them and they tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. I wrote that specifically because of not only what my grandson was telling me, but the sound of his voice. You could, it hit another pitch. And his friends and his mom and my friends' children, there was a sense that the lid was going to blow and blow sky high. So I was not in any way surprised. Who had to be surprised? Those who govern. So they could do nothing to stop it because they don't know if it's there. They don't even know if black people are there. The parliament, they didn't even know what was there. It was there for all those who were paying attention, would see and listen to people, not question them and say, are you going to be writing tomorrow? No. You just ask questions, and then suddenly they burst out as though they're completely fed up. I assure you, and your viewers, I knew something was on the agenda. The police did not know. I was in no surprise when Trident killed Duggan. None whatsoever. And I'm no surprise that they're going to use, I'm no surprise that they have weapons on the street now, armed police. I'm much more than normal. You mightn't see it. It might be tucked in a car somewhere.
Talk about
I'm no
what you feel.
that they're tapping the phones of all of us who have been outspoken. And it's no surprise if I come down the road late and they don't see anybody else to dive on me and pick me up and fancy a story. That is where we are now.
Darcus Howe, what do you think needs to be done? What would you, Darcus, what would you want to see happening right now? How do you think this should all be resolved? We're talking about 4 days of this uprising, of the riots, of the fires, of more than 1,000 people arrested, police out in the largest presence in history now in the streets of London and others. What do you think needs to happen right now?
There has to be an overture made to young blacks saying peace. And you could do that with making clear that you disassociate yourself. I'm talking about the Prime Minister now. Disassociate themselves with Operation Trident and dissolve it. Dissolve Operation Razorback, which is terrorizing communities right now. And the other thing, the genuine black intellectuals and working class unionists and so on should hold an international conference within the next 6 months to lay out precisely the state of society. We must have black Americans there. We must have broadcasters from all over the world and discuss the future of a civilization within a civilization and make that absolutely clear. We invite delegates from Africa, we invite delegates from the Caribbean and say this is not the country that Cameron boasts of, and how beneath the surface the terror and the disrespect on the question of race mainly, and we have to resolve it. We have to resolve it, and resolve it in a civilized way.
We're going to leave it there.
Not go with a demonstration to the House of Lords or Parliament and to your MP and all that. We have to lift it sky high and let the entire civilization of this world know that what they're doing in Afghanistan is much of what they do but to kill people here. I'm not angry, but I'm deadly serious. Every time I walk the street, my eyes are scanning the landscape for rogue police officers. I want my children to do that, and my grandchildren.
Darcus Howe, I want to
going
thank
to
you
see
for
them
being with
next
us.
Sunday.
Broadcaster and columnist who lives in Brixton, South London. Also Richard Seymour, who blogs at Lenin's tomb, both of them speaking to us from